everybody disappeared.
They're here, I can assure you.
All right, I'll believe you.
So, Salman, reading Joseph Anton, your memoir, I realized that you've been to Denmark several times, and during more pressing days also. But also at that point in the 90s, you were here and you went to Tivoli. Yes, and that was a moment of relief for you, I believe. So how's this journey been this time?
Well, we went back to the Tivoli. I think what happened back then in the 90s when things were very tense, is that, we had this moment of real release when we were not just in the Tivoli, we were on bumper cars, very aggressively. And it was very good for us, particularly for me. And so yesterday I thought we have to go back. So we got there just in time. We got there just before it closed, and we had the last ride of the night on the bumper cars. and it felt like going, closing a circle. So
that's what bumper cars are for.
That's what exactly. Everybody should have their personal bumper car, location.
Yes, we'll try to manage that next time in this house, maybe. And you've been to Noma as well?
Yes, I was in Noma today, so forgive me because I've eaten 21 courses. so I may be a little slow.
Yeah. And was it worth it?
Yes, I've always wanted to eat an ant.
So now you can put Anteater on your CV.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now I'm an Anteater.
Novelist Anteater.
Exactly.
Well, actually, I guess a lot of people have gathered you here in Denmark because you're the recipient of the Hans Christian Andersen Literary Award. And even though I realize that this question isn't exactly a fresh one, I need to ask it now. What is your relationship to Hans Christian Andersen?
Well, one of the strange things about these last few days is that as other people have been talking kindly about my work, I've discovered that I have a much closer relationship to Hans Christian Andersen than I thought, because lots of people have come up with connections, that appear to be true. That we both left home at the age of 14, and we both traveled a lot, etc. And then I discovered something that I'd never really thought about before. That I was doing a reading yesterday at the university, and I was reading a passage from Haroun and the Sea of Stories. And in this passage, the bad guys, who are kind of dark and shadow-like, have come detached from their shadows. And I thought, excuse me, I know where that comes from, But at the time that I wrote the book, I think I had forgotten where it came from. So it's a kind of unintended influence, or sort of forgotten influence, submerged, but there it is. So I appear to be much more like him than I thought, although not so tall, and not nearly so religious. So I still have a few differences to cling to.
Well, Bob Dylan also left home at 14, so there are a lot of people who did that.
Bob Dylan and Hans Christian Andersen, what are their similarities? That's the question.
Yes. I think but did the fairy tales play an important role in your early life?
Yeah. I mean, you grow up in India, you grow up drowning in fairy tales. Because there's such an enormous storehouse of fantastic tales that is available to you as a child and as an adult. And those were the first forms of literature that I ever encountered. And there were some but not all of the famous classics of Western children's literature showed up. And Hans Christian Andersen was one of the ones who did show up. At least the selection of his most famous stories. So he was somebody that I had read as a child
Yeah.
in India, but also, of course, there were all the Indian stories, the animal fables of the Panchatantra, and, you know, and the Arabian Nights, and I mean, one of the things people don't know is that the Arabian Nights, what we now think of as the Arabian Nights stories, probably have their origins in India.
Yeah.
That there was this group of stories, because there's one of the great lost texts of world literature, is this text called the Hazar Afsana, which means 1,000 stories, which originated in India, which moved west across the world, eventually encountered, because that was written in Farsi, which was the court language, and eventually collided with the Arab world, and was translated into Arabic, and other stories were added, and so on. And then that original text was completely lost. No copy of it survives. And the only way we know that it existed is because it's referred to by other people. But it appears to have included the framed story of a princess called Shahrazad telling stories to save her life. And it's a very sad thing that text should be lost. In fact, it makes you want to write it. You know,
Yeah.
I think wouldn't that be great to write one of the great lost texts of the world? You know, I mean, it's like the other one that I really have an urge to write is, you know, the Elizabethan dramatist Thomas Kidd wrote a play called Hamlet several years before Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And we don't know, because no text survives, we don't know how much Shakespeare borrowed from that play.
What's your professional guess?
You know, my view is that Shakespeare was Shakespeare, that's the problem. You know, he's just better than everyone else. So it doesn't matter if I mean, for instance, Shakespeare took a lot of his plots from this very kind of dodgy book of history called Holinshed's Chronicles. One of the stories in Holinshed's Chronicles is the story of a king called Macbeth. And there's a line in that which talks about the birth of Macbeth, you know, where he was born essentially by what we would now call a C-section. And it says, no, not Macbeth, Macduff, who eventually kills him. Macduff was from his mother's womb ripped, says Holinshed. Shakespeare adds one word, which is untimely. Macduff was from his mother's womb untimely ripped. Now, that's the difference between a historian and Shakespeare.
Yeah.
You know? And, because that gives rhythm and weight and meaning, etc., etc. So, you know, I think it doesn't matter if Thomas Kidd wrote Hamlet first, doesn't matter, Shakespeare probably wrote it better.
No.
You know, I mean, there's a great moment in the film Shakespeare in Love, when Joseph Fiennes, playing Shakespeare, is writing what we discover is Romeo and Juliet. And he writes this scene, and he stands up and he says, "God, I'm good." You know? And it's a big question. Did Shakespeare know he was Shakespeare?
Yeah.
You know?
What do you think?
I think he had to. I think you can't write that stuff and not know what you're writing.
No.
You know? I mean, you can't write King Lear and not know that you've written King Lear. You know? I mean, because it's the genius is so gigantic that it must be evident even to the author.
Okay.
You know? The big question is, was Shakespeare good in bed? And the answer is probably yes, damn it.
Still the anxiety of influence.
You know, I can't imagine Shakespeare being bad at anything.
I think Shakespeare in Love answers that question to some extent.
Yes.
Yeah.
At least Tom Stoppard's answer.
Yeah. But at the same time, mentioning Shakespeare, he also must have been a good reader in order to read all those original stories and make his own stories out of them. Well,
you know, the Elizabethan theatre was quite like what television is now, in the sense that there was an endless demand for new material, you know, because the audience wasn't very large. The population of London was like 1 million people at the time. And so plays would run out of audience, you know, quite quickly. So there was a desperation for new material all the time. And so Shakespeare, like everyone else, would steal plots wherever he could find them, you know, and then rework them. I mean, you know, he's writing 3 plays a year. I mean, imagine a modern dramatist having to produce 3 major 5-act plays every year, and for those then to, you know, in 1 year you write Midsummer Night's Dream, As You Like It, and Henry IV Part 2. I mean, most of us would settle for that for a lifetime. You know? And Shakespeare's doing that every year.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not
Does it
fair.
make you envious?
It's not fair.
No.
But he's dead.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, to some extent.
To some extent. That's very good. Yes, very well said. He's only dead to some extent.
No, going back to I mean, before Shakespeare there was the myths
Yes.
and the fairy tales and all that. How did you, when you grew up, did you read them yourselves, or did people read them to you?
Well, I mean both. Because,
Yeah.
I mean, certainly it's true that my father, you know, told me and my sisters bedtime stories, and many of my first hearings of the most famous of, let's say, the Arabian Nights stories, you know, were my father's versions of them. You know, the first time I ever heard about Sinbad the Sailor, or, you know, or Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, or whatever it might be, was in my father's versions. And then there were children's versions of them. You know, there were comic book versions of them, etc. There was, so yeah, it came at you from all directions, that material. And then there were movie versions of them, you know, so on. Not very good ones, but.
Did you know that your father did a version of them, so to speak? Could you tell when he was embellishing?
Yeah, no, I mean, to begin with, when we were little, we thought he was just making them up. And you know, and wow, he's got a great imagination. And then eventually you realize that because I mean, my father had in his library this beautiful old edition of the Richard Burton translation of the Arabian Nights, which is a translation that's okay as a translation. Not fantastic, but it's amazing for its footnotes, which are all about sex. I mean, Richard Burton was clearly obsessed with sex of all kinds, and sometimes the footnotes are more than half the page.
It's like David Foster Wallace.
So there's like 3 lines of story, and then, you know, 3/4 of the page is Richard Burton talking about sex. So if you're a teenager, this is very useful.
A lot of modern, I would say, a lot of modern novels looks like that. I mean, a novel by David Foster Wallace is basically 3 lines.
That. But you know, I could tell my parents, look, I'm reading the Arabian Nights. Whereas actually I was reading about sex.
Yeah. When you, one thing, when you read Joseph Anton, you realize that, I mean, fiction is early on very important to you, not only with the stories, as you mentioned here, but also the fact that you go to England was partly due to English literature.
Well, it was due to English children's literature. Yeah, because one of the sort of books that would show up, many of them were books about schools. You know, about English boarding schools. And we all read them, and we assumed they were telling the truth. That these places were lots of fun. I mean, you know, they were like Harry Potter without the magic, but still fun. And then my father asked me if I wanted to go to school in England, and I mean, if I look back on it, it's actually, you know, there are these moments in your life which are the real bifurcation moments. You know, when there's the road you take and there's the road you don't take, and my parents did not force me. In fact, my mother was completely against the idea. She thought it was a terrible idea. And my father said, it's up to you. Said, you know, and then he found out that there was this one English school called Rugby, which wrote back and said, well, if he comes up to the standard in the exams, then we probably have a place. And so he said, do you want to go? And
did you initiate it?
No, he initiated it, but then he came up with this particular option, and he said, you know, if you don't want to go, don't just say no, you know. And the thing that I think is really interesting to me about that 13-year-old boy is that he said yes. not that I was unhappy at home. I was very happy at home. And I was very happy going to school in Bombay, and I had lots of friends. I had a happy life. And yet something in me said, go see the world. And I hope it wasn't just English boarding school stories. So that's a tragic reason to change your life.
But also ironic, I would say, that literature had that impact on you in that way.
I mean, I'd like to believe it was some wonderful adventurous spirit of discovery that drove me across the world, you know.
That as well.
Kind of Columbus-like, you know, to discover a new world, you know.
But also, when you did go there, you said you write in Joseph Anton that you were, in a way, your letters home were your first form of fiction.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, and you know, the English boarding school, the English public school, which of course is a private school, at that time was a much harsher place than it is now. I'm talking about 1961 when I went. For a start, they were single-sex schools in those days. And now they're almost certainly, almost all of them are not anymore. And, you know, it's well known that girls have a civilizing effect on boys. You know, so the boys behave better when there are girls around.
I do agree.
It's not particularly good for the girls because they've got all these boys around, but it's good for the boys. So, you know, the boarding school is a slightly less testosterone-fueled space than it used to be. And also, it was still in those days the kind of place where you could get beaten if you did something bad. So physical punishment was still allowed. So, and you know, there wasn't enough hot water to have baths, so if you didn't get in the first baths, you had to be in a cold water bath, and it was like February, you know, and so it was horrible. And I didn't expect that. And also, it was a place where I first discovered racism. First discovered the feeling of being somebody else's other. You know, if you grow up, you don't think of yourself as an other. You think of yourself as yourself. And then you discover that people are treating you differently for some strange reason. And I thought, you know, I speak your language. You know, I've read your literature. I'm better at maths than you. What is your problem? You know, maybe that was the problem. And actually, I said it in the memoir somewhere. I came to think that there's 3 fatal mistakes that you can make at the English boarding school, and you can get away with making 2 of them, but you can't get away with making all 3. And the 3 mistakes are being foreign, being clever, and being bad at games.
No Quidditch.
So if you're foreign and clever, but you're really brilliant at cricket, everything's fine. You know? If you're foreign and bad at games, but you're not that clever, nobody cares.
You're no threat.
If you're clever and bad at games, but you're not foreign, that's okay. But all 3 is a triple whammy, you know? Like 3 strikes, you're out. And that was me. I was all 3. So yeah, I had a bad time to begin with, and then what happened is that I grew to I mean, it's not very great, my adult height, but I grew to, you know, 5'9" by the time I was 15. And so briefly, for about a year, I was taller than everyone. And then all of it stopped. Because I was bigger than them. And then by the time they got bigger than me, they'd also grown up a bit, and so it didn't start again.
But when you wrote to your family...
I lied. I wrote, you know, having a wonderful time, scored 23 not out in the cricket.
But that they knew was a lie? Or?
That they knew was a lie at once, because they knew that I couldn't play the game at all. But I wrote these letters back, which were full of, you know, positive feelings. And because I thought, you know, they've sent me all the way across the world, and it cost them so much money, and, you know, and I should make them feel that I'm having a good time. And so as a result, when I left school and told them what I'd actually experienced, they were absolutely horrified and mortified. They said, why didn't you tell us? You know, we'd have pulled you out of there. I thought, why didn't I tell them? That was dumb, you know. I mean, I think 14, 15-year-old boys are very stupid. That's probably the reason.
I know some of them.
Yeah, no, I mean,
they're lovely also, though.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've had a couple.
But was reading part of dealing with that situation for
Yes.
you? Yes.
Yeah, I used to read. I mean, I did more or less plunge into books and studies, but specifically into reading as a way of dealing with, isolation, loneliness, rejection, all those things that turn people into readers. See? See? You know what I mean.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But also, I think later on in your writings, you've been very clear on the issue of fiction versus escapism.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not interested in escapism. No. There's a kind of escapist fiction. Actually, there's a lot of it these days that's very, very popular. Books about vampires and I mean, the Twilight books, the Hunger Games. I mean, even God help us, 50 Shades of whatever color that is. I mean, you could escape into the kind of sadomasochistic dungeon if that happens to be what you feel like doing. Especially if it's just a fictional one, so you don't actually have to have those things done to you. But I'm not interested in that.
No.
It just has no interest in me at all, or for me at all, to write in a way which is an escape from the world.
No.
And I'm not interested in reading books which are an escape from the world.
No.
Except for one or two. I mean, The Lord of the Rings, maybe.
I thought that was about...
It's about World War II, but he always said it wasn't. No, it's about little people with big hairy feet.
Oh. That's one interpretation. When you wrote, you're going to read for us a section from your latest book of fairy tales, which you wrote for your son. And I was thinking, you said earlier in the interview that, I mean, the fairy tale has a universal appeal. And I was thinking, do you think that it still has that kind of universal appeal?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think this is a great age of fantasy.
Yeah.
The cinema is absolutely dominated by it.
Yeah.
It seems the only way you can make a lot of money in the cinema is by making a fantasy film now. And because the technology, in a way, has caught up to the imaginative powers of the filmmakers, you can literally make anything, visually plausible in a film. And so yes, I mean, it's a colossal age for the fantastic. Unfortunately, I do think a lot of it is of the escapist kind. I mean, the kind of fantasy films that I liked were films like Blade Runner. Which is dystopic and
now a realist movie. And now a realist movie.
Yes, exactly. And in some ways, I think Ridley Scott invented the future more accurately than anyone else, because the look of Blade Runner is now. I mean, you just have to go to Tokyo. There it is. Even the kind of linguistic ideas of Blade Runner, that you would have this language that street language, that people would speak, which was partly Japanese and partly English and partly Martian, and everybody would speak this garbled language of many languages, and actually people speak like that, So I think it was it was a visionary film in many ways, and most of the kind of dystopic urban fantasies that have followed it have basically copied that vision of what the future would look like. Batman movies, they're entirely based on the visual look of Ridley Scott, of Blade Runner. And of course, like all genuinely groundbreaking movies, it was universally trashed when it came out. Didn't get a single good review. Garbage, everybody said. And now many of the same people who said it was garbage write about it being a classic, but that's why I'm not a critic.
But as this answer shows, you have a keen interest in popular culture and always have.
Well, the movies, because I grew up in Bombay. Bombay is a gigantic movie city. So you can't grow up in Bombay without having the movies in your blood. I mean, I had one uncle and two aunts who worked in the movies. My uncle wrote for the movies, and both my aunts were performers in the movies in the 50s. And the films are being made on every street corner, and you can't get away from them. So yeah, I mean, and also in that period, much more so than now, Western movies, first-run Western films, would come to Bombay more or less immediately, because there were movie theaters which had deals with individual Hollywood studios. So I mean, there was a movie theater called the Metro, which showed MGM films, and there was one called the Eros, which showed Paramount films, and there was the New Empire, which showed 20th Century Fox films, and the Regal, which showed Columbia films, and so on. So all these things would show up right away. So as well as seeing all the latest Indian films, what was not then called Bollywood, they were just called the Bombay movies, you would also see all the first-run, And I mean, the Indian films, of course, were so filled with ridiculous, absurd, fantastic moments that fed your love for fantasy as well. One of my favorite, there's a parody, James Ivory, Merchant Ivory made a very funny, or occasionally very funny, satirical film about the Bombay cinema, which is called Bombay Talkie. And in that film, there's a scene in which the actress Jennifer Kendall, as an American reporter, visits the set of a big musical movie. And when she walks in, the set is a giant typewriter. And on several of the keys of the typewriter, there are dancing girls, performing whatever the dance number is. And she goes up to the director and says, "Could you explain the scene to me?" And he says, "Yes." He says, "You see, typewriter is the typewriter of life. And we are all dancing out our stories on the typewriter of life." See?
After that, there was no turning back.
And she's a little gobsmacked by this remark. So she doesn't quite know what to say.
No.
So she says, "Oh, that's very symbolic." and he says, "Thank you." So, you're born into a country which is obsessed with, trashy allegory. and how could you fail but write it,
Did you ever feel that you were taking a risk incorporating it in serious fiction? Because, I mean, not a lot of authors were doing it at the time.
No, but I mean, I don't know. It didn't, what I felt, to be serious for a moment, I felt when I was beginning to think about what turned into Midnight's Children, I had no idea what it would be at this point. What I felt is that most of the books I had read in English about India had two problems. One is that they were mostly about Western experiences of India, what happens to English people when they go to India, which appears to be, if they're women, that they either have a Maharaja waiting at the end of the railway station, because there seems to be an endless supply of Maharajas waiting for blonde English girls to get off trains, or they get raped. I mean, those appear to be the two plots. Sometimes both. In the same plot. And I thought, I don't want to write about a Western experience of the East. I want to write about, what it's like, what I want to write about an Indian experience of India. And the other thing I felt, and I felt this very strongly when I read a book that I very much admired, which was A Passage to India. I thought, this doesn't sound right.
No.
It sounds so tidy and clean and delicate and precise. And I thought, if there's one thing, or if there's four things that India is not, it's those things. That, but India is crowded and noisy and smelly and vulgar and not Forstierian, So I thought, and sometimes I was saying to somebody yesterday that sometimes negative influence can be as powerful as positive influence, then you can say, that's what I don't want to do. And that shows you what you do want to do. So I thought, if I don't want to write like E.M. Forster, whose novel I hugely admire, but I don't want to write it, how do I write the opposite of it?
Yeah.
And that took me some way towards the language of Midnight's Children.
Yeah.
How do you write crowd? How do you write noise and sensuality, and et cetera, et cetera? So these were the questions I asked myself.
Did you ever feel that you were entering a territory that was forbidden or verboten for serious writers?
No, I just thought it was kind of virgin. You know, it's a great feeling to feel you're stepping onto territory where nobody's been, which is very hard for a Western writer, where the novel is such a rich and long and a tradition, and when there's simply so many books. You know, it's very difficult to think of something to do that hasn't been done before. Everything's been done before. But at that point, the Indian novel in English was a relatively a trickle, you know, and there were things that hadn't been done before, you know, and I felt that I had stumbled on one of those things. I mean, of course, what's happened since then is that trickle has become a flood. And it's very nice to see, because now there's great diversity in the Indian novel in English, of a kind that they didn't used to be.
No. When you were writing these fairy tales for your sons, you were also incorporating, I mean, elements of Star Wars or popular culture or video games. Is that a way for you to connect with them, or do they mention this when you talk about those books?
I mean, well, Luca is the one that uses a kind of video game structure. And yes, my son liked that, because he was spending about 23 hours a day playing video games at the time, you know, 5 minutes sleeping, and so on. So yes, he liked it. I mean, I just thought, I was thinking about the narrative, the way narrative works in video games as they have developed. They've become much more sophisticated than they used to be. They used to be just, you know, shooting the space invaders. Now they've become very complex, and so complex that actually the game player can more or less write the narrative, because he can choose the way in which he journeys through the imaginary world. You know, you don't have to, it's not prescribed for you. You can go left or right. You can choose to go to town A or town B, and different things will happen to you depending which you do. So that's very interesting, you know, to be able to give the player that much control over the structure of the game, you know. So I thought all of that, you know, is stuff that you can think about and use bits of in this rather older-fashioned form of narrative.
Let's hear some of the opening pages.
Luca and the Fire of Life is the second book, which I wrote. I mean, Haroun and the Sea of Stories was written 18 years earlier for my older son. There's a big age gap between my sons. They needed a break. And then when my younger son, Milan, got to be the same age as my older son, Zafar, had been, he started saying, "Where's my book?" You know? So I thought, oh well, here we go again, you know? So in Luca and the Fire of Life, it's actually the same family as in Haroun and the Sea of Stories, except that Haroun has acquired a younger brother. Haroun has grown up and has a younger brother. So in that sense, it's exactly like my family, except what happens is different. I'll just read you the beginning.
Yes. Please.
Which is chapter 1, which is called The Terrible Thing That Happened on the Beautiful Starry Night. There was once, in the city of Kahani in the land of Alif Bey, a boy named Luca who had 2 pets, a bear named Dog and a dog named Bear, which meant that whenever he called out "Dog," the bear waddled up amiably on its hind legs, and when he shouted "Bear," the dog bounded towards him, wagging his tail. Dog, the brown bear, could be a little gruff and bearish at times, but he was an expert dancer, able to get up on his hind legs and perform with subtlety and grace the waltz, the polka, the rumba, the wah-wah-tusi, and the twist. as well as dances from nearer home, the pounding bhangra, the twirling ghumar, for which he wore a wide mirror-worked skirt, the warrior dances known as the spore and the thang ta, and the peacock dance of the south. Bear the dog was a chocolate Labrador and a gentle, friendly dog, though sometimes a bit excitable and nervous. He absolutely could not dance, having, as the saying goes, 4 left feet. But to make up for his clumsiness, he possessed the gift of perfect pitch, so he could sing up a storm, howling out the melodies of the most popular songs of the day, and never going out of tune. Bear the dog and Dog the bear quickly became much more than Luca's pets. They turned into his closest allies and most loyal protectors, as fierce in his defense, so fierce in his defense that nobody would ever have dreamed of bullying him when they were nearby. Not even his appalling classmate, Ratshit, whose behavior was usually out of control. This is how Luca came to have such unusual companions. One fine day when he was 12 years old, the circus came to town. And not just any circus, but the GROF, the GROF, the Great Rings of Fire itself, the most celebrated circus in all of Alif Bay, featuring the famous incredible fire illusion. So Luca was at first bitterly disappointed when his father, the storyteller Rashid Khalifa, told him they would not be going to the show. Unkind to animals, Rashid explained. Once it may have had its glory days, but these days the groff has fallen far from grace. The lioness had tooth decay, Rashid told Luca, and the tigress was blind, and the elephants were hungry, and the rest of the circus menagerie was just plain miserable. The ringmaster of the Great Rings of Fire was the terrifying and enormous Captain Arg, the Grandmaster Flame. The animals were so scared of the crack of his whip that the lioness with toothache and the blind tigress continued to jump through hoops and play dead, and the skinny elephant still made elephant pyramids for fear of angering him, for Arg was a man who was quick to anger and slow to laugh. And even when he put his cigar-smoking head into the lioness's yawning mouth, she was too scared to bite it off, just in case it decided to kill her from inside her belly. Rashid was walking Luca home from school, wearing as usual one of his brightly colored bush shirts, this one was vermilion, and his beloved battered Panama hat, and listening to the story of Luca's day. Luca had forgotten the name of the tip of South America and had labeled it Hawaii in a geography test. However, he had remembered the name of his country's first president and spelled it correctly in a history test. He had been smacked on the side of the head by Ratshit's hockey stick during games. On the other hand, he had scored 2 goals in the match and defeated his enemy's team. He had also finally got the hang of snapping his fingers properly so that they made a satisfying cracking noise. So there were pluses and minuses. Not a bad day overall. But it was about to become a very important day indeed, because this was the day they saw the circus parade going by on its way to raise its big top near the banks of the mighty Silsila. The Silsila was the wide, lazy, ugly river with mud-colored water, which flowed through the city not far from home. The sight of the droopy cockatoos in their cages and the sad dromedaries humping along the street touched Luca's generous young heart. But saddest of all, he thought, was the cage in which a mournful dog and a doleful bear stared wretchedly all about. Bringing up the rear of the cavalcade was Captain Arg with his pirate's hard black eyes and his barbarian's untamed beard. All of a sudden, Luca became angry, and he was a boy who was slow to anger and quick to laugh. When Grandmaster Flame was right in front of him, Luca shouted out at the top of his voice, "May your animals stop obeying your commands and your rings of fire eat up your stupid tent." Now it so happened that the moment when Luca shouted out in anger was one of those rare instances when by some inexplicable accident all the noises of the universe fall silent at the same time. The cars stop honking, the scooters stop putt-putting, the birds stop squawking in the trees, and everyone stops talking at once. And in that magical hush, Luca's voice rang out as clearly as a gunshot. and his words expanded until they filled the sky, and perhaps even found their way to the invisible home of the Fates, who, according to some people, rule the world. Captain Arg winced as if somebody had slapped him on the face, and then he stared straight into Luca's eyes, giving him a look of such blazing hatred that the young boy was almost knocked off his feet. Then the world started making its usual racket again, and the circus parade moved on, and Luca and Rashid went home for dinner. But Luca's words were still out there, in the air, doing their secret business. That night, it was reported on the TV news that in an astonishing development, the animals of the Groff Circus had unanimously refused to perform. In a crowded tent, and to the amazement of costumed clowns and plainclothes customers alike, they rebelled against their master in an unprecedented act of defiance. Grandmaster Flame stood in the center of the ring of the 3 great rings of fire, bellowing orders and cracking his whip. But when he saw all the animals beginning to walk calmly and slowly towards him, in step, as if they were an army, closing in on him from all directions until they formed an animal circle of rage, his nerve cracked and he fell to his knees, weeping and whimpering and begging for his life. The audience began to boo and throw fruit and cushions, and then harder objects, stones, for example, and walnuts and telephone directories. Arg turned and fled. The animals parted ranks and let him through, and he ran away, crying like a baby. That was the first amazing thing. The second took place later that night. A noise started up around midnight, a noise like the rustling and crackling of 1 billion autumn leaves, or maybe even 1 billion. A noise that spread all the way from the big top by the banks of the Silsila to Luca's bedroom and woke him up. When he looked out of his bedroom window, he saw that the great tent was on fire, burning brightly in the field by the river's edge. The great rings of fire were ablaze, and it was not an illusion. Luca's curse had worked.
As you mentioned earlier, this kind of language is influenced by a lot of stuff. But one thing that when you look at interviews with you, there are hardly any questions about how you go about constructing these things.
Yeah.
I mean, and your method, how you actually do every day when you sit at the table or where you are.
Table, yeah, there's a table.
Yeah. And there's a computer?
Yeah, there's a computer and there's a chair.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
You know, there's all that stuff.
Yeah.
How do I do it? I don't know. I just sit there and something happens. No, I mean, I think there's a couple of things to say about process. One is that, I mean, all writers have their own little ways. You know, I mean, there are things that I can't do. I can't wake up early and write. I mean, I know people who wake up at 5 a.m. and start work at 6, and they've sort of finished by noon, and then they can spend the rest of the day drinking and playing tennis. Smart and aimless. And there are other people who will work very late, very, very late at night. You know, and I mean, I can't do that stuff. I just do it like an office job. You know, I mean, the only difference is that the office is in my home. So I just wake up and go downstairs and sit at the desk and start, and more or less do kind of 9 to 5 job. And I mean, the one thing that's happened with the passing of the years is that I have become very disciplined. I mean, I'm actually able to sit there and shut the world out. You know, and it's very often the case that I will, when I'm really concentrating and working well, that I will think I've been doing it for a couple of hours, and I look up and it's like 6 hours later.
Yeah.
That happens. But really, I mean, I think that for me, the secret is this. I mean, I'm fortunate to have this gift of concentration, you know, which helps me enter the world of the story and leave alone the world that I spend the rest of my time in. There are other things that happen sometimes. I mean, I remember listening to the novelist Joseph Heller, author of Catch-22, talking about his method once, in which he said that very often what happened is that he would think of a sentence, and he would know that that sentence led to 200 other sentences. He said that's, with Catch-22, he thought of this sentence which was, it was love at first sight the moment he saw the chaplain, Yossarian, fell in love with him. And he thought, oh, okay, now I know how to write the book. When he wrote his second novel, Something Happened, he thought of a sentence which was, in the office in which I work, there are 5 people of whom I'm afraid. And he thought, oh, okay, I get it, And that's sometimes happened to me. I mean, it actually happened to me with Haroun and the Sea of Stories, because the problem of that book was tone of voice. If you want to write a book, this is another Hans Christian Andersen reference, which has layers, so that children can read it one way and adults can read it another way. The difficult thing is tone of voice, because it's very easy to fall into excessive childishness or excessive adulthood. Where do you draw that line? How do you walk that line between those two things? And I found it quite difficult. For a while. And then I thought of, what isn't here, is here. What is now the first sentence of the book, which is, there was once in the country of Alif Bay a sad city, the saddest of cities, a city so ruinously sad that it had forgotten its name. It stood by a mournful sea full of glumfish, which were so miserable to eat that they made people belch with melancholy even though the skies were blue. And I thought, oh, okay, I got it, Boom! And it is like that. It's like when you hit the note, then you think all I have to do is listen to that note. And as long as I'm hitting that note, everything will be well. So that was useful. I mean, something similar happened with the beginning of Midnight's Children, because again, I was very uncertain exactly how to write it. In fact, when I first started to write it, I was writing it, I mean, it's now a first-person narrative, but originally was not, in this very early stumbles towards the book. And the third-person narrative just seemed to me to be, in some odd way, inert, And then I thought, let me just see what happens if I let him tell the story. Let me just try it, And I've always thought of that day as the day that I became a writer. Because I sat down at the typewriter. We had these things called typewriters.
With people dancing on them.
Yes. We also had things called telegrams. And telephones with dials, which went like that. Anyway, so in that ancient time, I was sitting at my desk and I wrote, I let him start to tell the story, and I wrote down something quite like what is now the first paragraph of Midnight's Children. And I thought, where did this come from? Because it was a voice, I could tell that it was the best paragraph I'd ever written in my life. And it wasn't me writing it, it was him writing it. I thought, how do you do that? But let's do some more of it. And at that point I understood that I'd found out how to write the book. And that all I had to do was let it go, because it's a very garrulous voice. It's very talkative, he's got a lot of words to say, and digressive, and he never shuts up, sometimes very irritatingly. But that's who he is. And I thought, okay, just let him run. Let him run and hold on to the coattails and see where he goes. And that became the book.
this famous quote from Anthony Burgess. He said that there are two kinds of writers. There's writers who are storytellers, writers, and writers that are users of language. Do you believe that this is a distinction that is true or just construed?
No, I mean, the trouble with anything you can say about writing is that it's not true. Or not always true.
Okay.
You know, I mean, it's true for some people, but not for other people.
Well, for you?
No, I mean, I think I'm interested in language, and I think I'm interested in story.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't see that you have to be one or the other.
No.
I mean, I can see that when Burgess is talking about Joyce, that Joyce is on the language side of that fence, and less. I mean, you know, Ulysses is not exactly plot-driven.
No, but the plot is there from the beginning, so...
Yeah, but what's the plot, you know? Middle-aged, cuckolded, Jewish advertising salesman walks around Dublin for the day, leches after club-footed girl at beach, goes to red light district, gets even more drunk, meets young guy, brings him home in the middle of the night, maybe tries to pimp out his wife to young guy. The end.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a lot of plot.
No.
Nobody would read Ulysses for the storyline.
No.
You know, they read Ulysses for all these other pleasures, pleasures of language and character. You know? So yes, so in Burgess, and Burgess was, of course, a great Joycean scholar. When he's talking about, I suspect he has that kind of distinction in mind, because it's true that the modernist movement did move somewhat away from the plot-driven narrative, which it saw as being 19th century and old-fashioned, and more towards this other kind of story, which was shaped by social concern and character and language. You know? But I think, as I say, there are other writers of whom it's not true. You know, if you read a writer like let's say Mikhail Bulgakov, you know, you have a writer who's as interested in language as in story. And that's also true of Italo Calvino. It's true of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. You know, so what's true sometimes is not true at others. I mean, it's the problem with literature is that it's so protean a form, it's so metamorphic, it is transforming itself all the time. That really what was true yesterday is not true tomorrow. You know? And then it's true again the day after.
But the image that you so correctly say about literature being protean and all these things that are true and not true at the same time, it also requires some kind of freedom. Freedom for the readers and freedom for the writers to interpret it in different ways. Do you think that the knowledge these days, that you have these kind of, that the readers are good at doing this kind of interpretation that requires from them? When you have to train for this kind of...
Well, two things I would say. One is that readers have forgotten certain kinds of information, but they've learned other kinds. So, you know, it used to be the case in the kind of heyday of the novel in the 18th, 19th century, that you could assume that your reader would have a certain body of knowledge of, for example, mythology. So if you were to refer to a Greek myth, if you were to refer to Achilles or Hector or something, you could assume that your readers would all know what you're talking about. Now you can't take that for granted. Some people do, but others do not. What we now have instead of that is what gets called popular culture. You know, we have a broad body of shared information. You know, it's still there. It's just a different body of shared information. You know, so I remember proving this point once at the Hay Literary Festival by quoting a brief section of a song by Elvis Presley. When I said, "Bless my soul, what's wrong with me? I'm itchy as a man on a fuzzy tree. My friends say I'm acting queer as a pup. I'm in love." The audience goes, "Ugh." We all know the I'm all shook up. You know? So we have now another body of shared knowledge. And I think what's intelligent for a writer, because you need to be able to refer to things.
Yeah.
You know, be able to say this is like that.
Yeah.
You know, you want to be able to say that in a book. You know, what's happening to this person is like this that happened in that song.
Yeah.
You know, you just have to be aware of the fact that it's a different body of shared information.
Yeah, but it also, I mean, say if you do make a reference to Mad Men or Breaking Bad or whatever, some years later there's different kind of TV shows that are all the rage.
No, that's absolutely true. There is the problem, but that's a problem which even the classics share. You know, I mean, if you read Anna Karenina, he's always referring to, you know, little cafes where certain things happen, and we don't know what the hell he's talking about, you know, because he's talking about the contemporary culture, you know, and when Bulgakov in The Master of Margarita is satirizing the literary world of Moscow at the time, we don't know who he's satirizing. So a lot of the satire misfires because we don't know what the original is, you know. So that's just, I mean, that's just the problem, you know. But if you do it well enough, then at least the thing stands on its own. I mean, that's the trick, is not to depend on the reference, you know, but to make it if it seems relevant at the time. So the problem of dating is a real problem, because, you know, if you want to write my kind of book, you want to write books that you hope will last, you know, and you hope will not need vast amounts of explication to future generations. But, you know, if you read anything now that was written 100, 200 years ago, there are footnotes. You know, they have to be, I mean, Shakespeare, there's lots of Shakespeare that's impenetrable.
Richard Burton, Arabian Nights.
Have you seen it again? Yes, and preferably the footnotes should be about sex. But it's true that, you know, the past is, you know, the famous opening of L.P. Hartley's novel *The Go-Between*, which he says the past is another country. They do things differently there, and we just have to accept that. The past is, and when we become the past, there will be people in the future who see that we do things differently. You know.
And these days you have always the internet that you can check up things.
Google. Yes. I remember when do you remember when you first heard the word Google? I mean, it's not very long ago, you know, it's like 15 years ago. And I remember somebody, because the internet used to be this impenetrable space where you couldn't find anything, you know, and all these early search engines, they were useless. They jammed all the time, and you know, the algorithms were crap.
Like a modernist novel gone mad.
Exactly. We'll try and think of whose modernist novel in a minute. And then somebody said to me, there's this thing called Google. I said, well, that's a stupid name. and they said, well, it's based on, you know, the idea of the mathematical infinite number, the Googleplex. And I said, but it's spelt wrong. And here's something that can't spell its own name. How useful is that? You know? And they said, no, just try it. Just try it. It really works. And then, of course, the moment you typed into your browser the words google.com, you know, the internet just opened like that, opened like a flower, and suddenly this huge world of information was available to you. But it's very new.
Has it shared the way that we read fiction, you think?
I don't know what it's done exactly. I don't know what it's done. I mean, I worry a lot about the phenomenon of fan fiction, because it's so crappy. You know? And yet that's where, you know, Twilight started out as Harry Potter fan fiction. 50 Shades started out as Twilight fan fiction. So it just gets worse and worse and worse, you know. And God knows what 50 Shades fan fiction will look like. You know? But I'd like to not find out.
Yeah. No. But maybe Shakespeare was kind of writing a fan fiction out of Thomas Kidd.
Yeah, but he was Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And what's her name is not. E.L. James. Yeah. Good idea to keep your first name secret, lady.
But do you are also worried that the fact that the internet is changing also publishing, changing the public discourse?
What I think is we don't know what's going to happen.
No.
I mean, I think that, it's true that every new medium creates new art forms. It always has. And I think with this new medium, we writers have not yet learned what the new art form is. Let's say the visual artists, I think, have begun to. I mean, there's a lot of, just about all the most significant visual artists are to some extent also working in the digital field, and making very interesting work. Filmmakers have discovered the potential of the internet for making films very cheaply and independently and putting them up and having some success. So the visual arts and music, of course, music has used the internet to very good effect. Although the internet has has done the opposite to music, because it's sort of destroyed the ability of musicians to earn a living from record sales, anyway.
But also changed the album as art form.
And changed all that, yeah. So we can see how it's going. In literature, I think we can't see how it's going yet.
No.
I've always felt that thing that we were talking about telling a story sideways, rather than in linear narrative.
Yeah.
It may be somewhere there, that the thing that the video game does, that if you're playing, I don't know what, Red Dead Redemption, if you're playing Assassin's Creed, if you're playing Grand Theft Auto, I mean, you can go through the game in the way that you choose.
Yeah.
And I can see it would be interesting to write a story like that.
Yeah.
Where you use the hyperlink to allow readers to jump sideways.
Yeah.
Between different. I mean, it's really very similar to the idea that Borges wrote about in his story, The Garden of Forking Paths. In fact, some people have suggested that in that story, Borges kind of invented the internet. He invented that idea of the endlessly bifurcating world in which all variants of everything could be available. And you can see that it might be interesting to write a story like that. But I don't think we've seen yet the first literary masterpiece of the new form.
No.
But I mean, it's not going to be written by me, I'll tell you that. It's going to be written by somebody aged 16. Or maybe a year or two older. But I mean, I'm interested to know what it is.
You grew up in a household where you were kissing books, you write, in imaginary homelands. And
it's just a thing we were taught, that you treat books with respect. So if you drop them to the floor, you pick them up and kiss them.
Could you kiss a Kindle?
I cannot kiss a Kindle, no. I'm not going to kiss that.
No, I think it's kind of dirty at this point
but, I'm not kissing your iPad. Sorry.
Yeah, it's
I mean, I'd like you, but I'm not kissing your iPad.
Point taken. Yeah.
Right. We don't know each other that well.
No, but do you think that are you worried that the notion of what a book is being changed by the digital system?
No, I don't. I don't know. I'm sort of ludicrously optimistic about this. I think it's very interesting what happened with. I mean, actually, truthfully, I don't care about ebooks. If people are reading, let them read. I don't really care about the platform. But it's interesting that ebook sales, having initially exploded, seem to have plateaued. And they seem to have plateaued somewhere between a quarter and a third of the market. And it seems as if that old-fashioned thing, what we now call the hard copy, is remarkably persistent. And as I've sometimes said, it's actually a very sophisticated piece of software. If you drop it in the bath, it does not lose its data. If you get sand in it, you can shake the sand out, and it doesn't impair its function. It continues to offer you its information. You can read it in quite low light levels and at very high light levels. Take that iPad out into the sunlight, and you can't read it. Also, it doesn't become obsolete.
No.
You know, whereas this new technology becomes obsolete at the most remarkable speed. You know, what's a floppy disk?
It's like Alta Vista.
You know? Exactly. It's like, what I'm saying is that this thing which is supposed to be the future becomes the past at very high speed. Whereas this thing which is supposed to be the past sticks around and performs in the future. So I think, you know, we've actually got, you know, maybe just put an apple on the cover.
I mean, what you actually talk about here is some kind of Orwellian bargain that we've made also with these kind of companies.
Well, I think certainly you know, I mean, the big problem is to do with the distribution end. You know, in other words, you know, Amazon. Darth Vader, as we call it.
The horseman of the apocalypse.
Yeah, I mean, it's very worrying because it's not unlike what iTunes did to the music business. I mean, which was to enormously increase quantity, but for the artist to make such a tiny percentage of each sale that no matter how great the quantity of the sales, the artist couldn't make a living. So musicians nowadays essentially can't make a living from record sales, from downloads. They could only make a living from public performance.
Or writing autobiographies.
Or writing, yes, if you're Keith Richards. Well, if you're Keith Richards, you get somebody else to do it for you.
But a good guy.
But a good one, anyway, but, you know, writers, unfortunately, if that model is followed in writing, where a monopoly distributor like Amazon drives the price down so low that we're all broke, writers can't go on the road to make a living. You know, we don't get Rolling Stones-sized audiences. Unfortunately.
We publishers don't either.
We can't sell T-shirts.
Well, I beg to differ. Sorry.
You know, I mean, it's not going to work for us in the way that it works for you too. You know, we will make less money than that. And so if the income that comes from the actual object disappears, then we're screwed. You know, and I'm afraid that's what Amazon looks like it's trying to do. You know, so I mean, good for Hachette that they're fighting back, and I'd like to see more publishers joining that battle. Because Amazon can't do it if they don't have any books to sell. And there's no reason. It seems to me publishers have a perfectly good distribution system set up. They just need to have people on board who are able to use it. You know, they've got warehouses. They can direct sell. You know, and it may be that what has to happen, I think, is that the monopoly has to be broken. You know, that while you've got Amazon sitting there owning the whole market, you know, it feels that it can dictate terms. So we need that old capitalist thing called competition.
We have to go into the Death Star and shoot it down.
You have to send some of those ex-fighters in sort of sideways, one shot to hit the thing, and but, you know, use the Force, Luke. You know.
But also there's the question of what they're doing with the information. As we know, I mean, the NSA, and I mean, it's almost like a Thomas Pynchon novel these days.
Well, I mean, Pynchon wasn't wrong about those things. I mean, we live in a very watched society, which I guess is fine unless you're doing something you shouldn't be.
Well, let's...
I mean, I don't know.
Well...
I'm totally clean.
I want to ask you one question. Now that you've been living in America for some time, and all over Europe now, we've seen changes in politics. We've seen how migrants are being hunted down in Europe. We've seen that nationalist parties are on the rise and populist parties are on the rise. And you wrote a masterpiece on migration, a modern masterpiece on migration, as in Satanic Verses. Looking at Europe from your perspective, how do you view that all this that is happening here right now?
Well, I mean, with great concern. You know, I mean, what's interesting is that all kinds of old demons seem to be escaping from the box. You know, on the one hand, you know, racist persecution. On the other hand, I mean, the rise of anti-Semitism, such as probably hasn't been seen in Europe since the end of World War II. It's as if everybody suddenly has permission to be their worst selves, you know. And I mean, it's a very, I don't know, it's a very disturbed world, and it's behaving like it.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I hope that it's a short-lived phenomenon, you know, because I think it has to be. Otherwise, these societies which have prided themselves on their openness and freedom are going to stop being those societies, you know. And a lot of it has to do with fear. We do live in very fearful times, and a lot of that fear is aimed at Islam, because while Islam is not the only religion that has led to violence in recent times, you have to say that it's where most of the violence is coming from, or at least people acting in its name. I'm not sure that ISIS are very devout.
No.
You know, I'm not sure that the Taliban knew which way of the Quran was up.
No.
But so, I mean, really what they're after is power.
Yeah.
Power cloaked in the language of religion.
Yeah.
But if people constantly say that they're doing something in the name of religion, you can't pretend that religion has nothing to do with it.
No.
Because the people doing those things say they're doing it in the name of the religion. So, and I think, you know, that creates a backlash.
Yeah.
It does. You know, and the backlash often affects people who are totally innocent, as backlashes do. I mean, one of the things I think is worth saying is that most of the Islamic violence that there is in the world today is aimed at other Muslims. You know, it's not aimed at the West at all.
No.
I mean, if you look at what's happening in what used to be Iraq, I mean, that's a Sunni-Shia fight. And if you look at what happened in Afghanistan, you know, the people the Taliban were after were the citizens of Afghanistan. You know, and the people that are oppressed by the Ayatollahs in Iran are the people of Iran, and so on. You know? So it's possible to see this as a movement of oppression inside the Muslim world, you know, and to try and identify progressive voices in that world to support and strengthen and magnify, and, you know, try and help the best of that world rather than allow the worst of that world to define it. You know, easy to say. Easy to say, but I mean, I think it's very important that people are protected. That people are protected and able to live their lives free from fear in Western society. But I also think that does not mean that you protect their ideas.
No.
You know, I mean, if I don't believe in God, if I don't believe in a flat Earth, and you do, it's acceptable for me to say, I think you're an idiot. You know, if you have a belief system that I find to be ridiculous, I have to be able to say so. You know, so, and I think one of the mistakes that we've made in Europe, and to a lesser extent in America, but a lot in Europe, is to allow those two things to blur together. You know, so that criticizing a belief system is considered to be equivalent to attacking individuals. You know? And then that creates the resentment where people say, well, there's special privileges for those people. You know, because why should one particular set of ideas be protected from debate when no other ideas are? You know? So I think we've got to somehow think better here. We've got to separate protecting individuals from censoring criticism of their ideas. You know, I mean, that's just a little bit of it. That's just a little bit of it. You know, but clearly there's economic turbulence in Europe. There's one of the things I think that feeds radicalism around the world is a kind of economic hopelessness. That, you know, you have countries in which young men, they mostly are young men, are futureless. You know, there's no way for them to get a decent job or to raise a family or et cetera, et cetera. And so, you know, you pick up a gun, you get a uniform, you get meals, you get some money for your family. It's you know, it's a thing to do.
A career.
Well, it's also, you know, gives you a sense of worth.
Yeah,
It can do, you know. So if you have also, as we've had in Europe in recent years, a dreadful economic crises, those things lead towards this kind of crypto-fascism, you know, very readily and always have.
Yeah.
I mean, Nazism arose out of the economic collapse of Germany in the 30s. So, I mean, that's some of it. I don't have a solution. You know, I'm a novelist.
I have two questions for you left before we have to stop, and the first question is also with a reference to Hans Christian Andersen, actually, because in Joseph Andersen you mentioned the Snow Queen and the story about how the fear of sorrow and chill to transform you forever, so to speak, in what happened to you during the Fatwa. And yet, for someone who has been reading you through these years in articles or in books, I'm always startled by the fact that the lingering feeling is never the feeling of bitterness or even of anger or loss, but more, although I mean, there's sometimes that too, but also the will to fight and to move on and to continuously engage with the world. What made you such a fighter?
Survival technique. I mean, one of the things that I knew very quickly is that I didn't want to be the creature of this event.
No.
You know, I wanted to remain the person I'd always been. And those emotions that you list, you know, anger, bitterness, vengefulness, etc. I mean, I don't deny that I've got some anger about what happened, you know. But if you allow those to dominate you, then you are defined by the event.
Yeah.
You know, and then that's a defeat.
Yeah.
That's a defeat. And I just thought that the best thing I can do is to try and stay on the road I thought I was on. You know, go on writing my books. You know, somebody wants to shut you up, don't shut up. That was my plan. If somebody is trying to silence you, shout louder. You know,
Rowdyism.
and if possible, better.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that's the best. Continuing is the best revenge. You know, if somebody's trying to stop you from continuing is the best thing you can do. And I also thought, I just don't want to carry this burden around for the rest of my life of anger, vengefulness, bitterness. I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be that guy walking in the room looking bitter.
No.
And so, you know, you have to learn how to let go of stuff.
Yeah.
You know, and letting go of stuff is also a way of setting yourself free. You know, because then you discover, okay, that happened, but now it's not.
No.
And now this is happening, and that's more interesting. I mean, I'm, you know, happier to be here than there. This is a better end of the story to be at. But, you know, I think you have to. I think also one of the things about being a novelist is the novel is truly, in the true meaning of the word, vulgar. You know, it's you know, the Latin word vulgus means the populace, the people. The novel is the form which lives in the world. You know, and all novelists that I admire are people who have, you know, plunged their arms into the world as deeply as they can to find as much of life as they can grab onto. If you think about Dickens, the range of character and event and setting, and you know, Thackeray, you know, Joyce, you know, the extraordinary love of life, you know, in great writers. And I think you can learn from that. You know, I think if you go towards life, you know, not into some crust of bitterness. And there's lots of it. There's lots of it, and much of it is worth writing about.
There's a beautiful endnote in the essay "In Good Faith," where you say, "Our lives teach us who we are." What would you say that you've learned?
Well, meh.
I know.
In one sentence, in 10 words or less. Well, one of the things I learned was that I guess I learned that I was a little tougher than I thought I was.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I wouldn't have bet on myself. You know, if you had told me on February the 14th, 1989, this is what's going to happen in the next decade. You know, how do you think you'll be 10 years from now? You know, I would have thought I would not really be in very good shape.
No.
You know, and yet improbably, I was in reasonable shape.
Yeah.
I had very bad hair. And you know, my wardrobe needed a lot of attention.
Yeah.
But on the whole, I was in reasonable shape.
Yeah.
And it's surprising to me. It's surprising to me and unexpected. And yet, you know, I think one of the things, I mean, I think it's in this book somewhere, but one of the things I think is that there are questions that you can be asked which you don't know the answer to until the question is asked. You can't answer it theoretically in advance.
No.
You know, what would you feel if?
No.
You know, the answer to that is meaningless. The only answer to the question is the answer you give when you're actually faced with the situation. And I think many of us would discover when faced with extreme situations that we found in ourselves a resilience and we found resources that we did not suspect ourselves of having. Because the survival instinct is unbelievably strong. You know, the most powerful instinct of human beings is the instinct to survive. And when the survival instinct is triggered, it's only triggered when you're actually in an extreme situation. You can't summon up the survival instinct.
No.
But when it's triggered, it's an incredibly powerful force. You know, it takes hold of you and it says, live, live, live. And you do whatever it takes to live. You know? So I read that's something I learned. I also learned, seriously, I learned it's a very interesting question to be asked. People are trying to kill you. Is it worth it? You know, what you did, is it worth putting your life on the line for? You know, should you just throw it in, grovel, ask for forgiveness, you know, and crawl away into a hole somewhere, but not have all these people trying to kill you? Would that be better? Or is there something that you believe in so strongly that you would put your life on the line for it? And I genuinely thought that in this, I mean, Christopher Hitchens and I talked about this, and we had very much the same formulation about it, that on the one side, there's everything in life that I care about, you know, liberty, art, love, friendship. And on the other side, there's almost everything that I detest. Bigotry, fanaticism, violence, etc. Then you think, well, I didn't pick the fight, but if I'm in the fight, it's the right fight. And this is the side I'm on. And yeah, you know, then you're in the fight, you fight it. And I discovered that. I discovered that there was something, you know, and if you're a satirist, you don't always know what you stand for. If your writing is by nature comic and satirical, the satirist always knows what he's against. You know, that politician's a moron. You know, well, all politicians are morons. You know, and so you spend your life poking fun and debunking and et cetera, and that's your nature. But in this kind of a battle, knowing what you were against wasn't nearly enough.
No.
You know, I knew what I was against. People tried to kill me. I was against it. I mean, that was easy. The question is, you had to also understand what you were for.
Yeah.
And I think this experience taught me a lot about that. And I think I'm clearer about it than I used to be.
Salman Rushdie, thank you very much for being so gracious and entertaining and fantastic.
Thank you.
Okay.
You want me to read that? You start. All right. We'll read it. All right. I mean, it's not just unconnected to what we were just talking about, but there's just a passage, just a paragraph near the end of Joseph Anton, in which I try and talk about something about what literature knows. You know? So I'll just read that. It might be a good way to stop. This was what literature knew and had always known. Literature tried to open the universe, to increase, even if only slightly, the sum total of what it was possible for human beings to perceive, understand, and so finally to be. Great literature went to the edges of the known and pushed against the boundaries of language, form, and possibility to make the world feel larger, wider than before. Yet this was an age in which men and women were being pushed towards ever narrower definitions of themselves, encouraged to call themselves just one thing, Serb or Croat, or Israeli or Palestinian, or Hindu or Muslim or Christian or Baha'i or Jew. And the narrower their identities became, the greater was the likelihood of conflict between them. Literature's view of human nature encouraged understanding, sympathy, and identification with people not like oneself. But the world was pushing everyone in the opposite direction, towards narrowness, bigotry, tribalism, cultism, and war. There were plenty of people who didn't want the universe opened, who would in fact prefer it to be shut down quite a bit. And so when artists went to the frontier and pushed, they often found powerful forces pushing back. And yet they did what they had to do, even at the price of their own ease and sometimes of their lives. The poet Ovid was exiled by Caesar Augustus to a little hellhole on the Black Sea called Tomis. He spent the rest of his days begging to be allowed to return to Rome, but permission was never granted. So Ovid's life was blighted. But the poetry of Ovid outlasted the Roman Empire. The poet Mandelstam died in one of Stalin's labor camps, but the poetry of Mandelstam outlived the Soviet Union. The poet Lorca was killed by the Falangist thugs of Spain's Generalissimo Franco, but the poetry of Lorca outlived Franco's tyrannical regime. Art was strong. Artists, less so. Art could perhaps take care of itself. Artists needed defenders. He had been defended by his fellow artists when he needed it. He would try to do the same for others in need from now on. Others who pushed boundaries, transgressed, and yes, blasphemed. All those artists who did not allow men of power or the cloth to draw lines in the sand and order them not to cross.